Okay, good morning again to all. Our session is now being recorded. Mame asked if I'm still grading essays. You better believe it, Mame. There are 80 people in this group, 80 people in this group. I cannot sit down and grade all the essays in 5 minutes or even in 5 days. So I am, yes, working my way through them. And mostly that's okay. Don't be sorry. I'm happy to do it. I just can only do so many a day. And give them the attention that, well, I will get your grades in. My normal turnaround time is a week to 10 days for this large of a class. With a normal class, which is now about 35 people, I can do them in a week. With 80 people, I kind of double down on the effort. And I think this time I'm working in reverse alphabetical order. The first essay, I started from the A's and ended up in the Z's. And this time I'm going backwards. So the people with Z always end up waiting. The people at the other end of the alphabet always end up waiting for everything. So to kind of even that out a little bit, make it fairer, I'm working backwards. So I've started with the Z's and I'm going to work up. So if your last name begins with if your last name begins with an A, B, C, D, E, etc., so you'll be, the last ones to receive your grades for this essay. And now you're asking whether for the third one I should start in the middle. Well, Mame, that would be the fairest way to do it. But if I start in the middle, which way do I go from there? Toward the A's or toward the Z's? Or am I supposed to take a random walk? Well, there you go. If you have no idea, why should I have an idea? But if I started L or M, then I'd have to go one step up and then 2 steps down and then 3 steps up and 4 steps down, which I could do, I suppose, but it would be a little more confusing. So maybe I'll do them in random order, okay? But I will get them done. Bear with me, and those of you who I've already graded a fair chunk of them at the bottom of the alphabet, and you can find your grades posted along with my comments, okay? So I'll be working on that. And while we're on housekeeping, since you're bringing up the housekeeping, let me make one important housekeeping announcement. I emailed you all yesterday. Maybe some of you have seen that email. But today, I just want to remind you, yes, you have good. Abraham, good. I'm glad you have. Some of you have. Today is World Philosophy Day. That's a nice thing for us as philosophers, because in 2002, UNESCO recognized the importance of philosophy, not just for philosophers, but for world culture and for world civilization, and for not only the diversity of philosophy in the world, but also for the long history of philosophy, which is, after all, as long as our history itself. So there have been philosophers in every culture since the earliest times of recorded history. And so World Philosophy Day is meant to remind everybody of not only the historicity and ubiquity of the discipline, but also, I think, of its relevance and continued relevance to everyday life. Okay? So anyway, it's very nice. And we have, as part of that festivity, arranged a very special lecture for you. That is, our philosophy department cordially invites you tonight at 7 p.m. To Zoom into a lecture by David Chalmers, who's a Western philosopher, Australian, and with a cross-posting in New York. And he's one of the leading Western experts on the philosophy of consciousness. So that will be undoubtedly his topic for tonight. He's going to ask, what is consciousness? And we've already touched on that, of course, in the first section of this course, in the first section of our course. I hope you haven't forgotten. Yes, it will be, and I think hopefully you'll be able to challenge him. I know you challenge me at times with your questions, Abraham, and others, so please tune in if you have the leisure to do it tonight. I sent the Zoom link to you all in an email yesterday to the whole class, so you're more than welcome to tune in and to hear what he has to say about consciousness, which is the hard problem after all, and see whether you agree or disagree or want to question him, okay? And that's our contribution to World Philosophy Day, and I certainly hope you enjoy it, all right? So that's a bit of housekeeping, and now a little more housekeeping. You're, I'm sure, well aware next week is Thanksgiving. That is, I think, Thursday and Friday. Officially, there are no classes as far as the academic calendar is concerned. You're aware of this, correct? That next week is Thanksgiving? Okay. Well, but make sure that you attend on Monday, because I will be doing the usual plenary lecture, and we'll be covering a very important topic, the prisoner's dilemma, which is a really interesting, I think, and very widely applicable model with surprising real-life applications. It's not just a philosophical exercise. It has real-world applications, which we'll be looking at too. So, I mean, in fairness, you know that I have basically, because of the complications of COVID and the lockdown and the, you know, and the fact that we're meeting online and all, what I'm planning to do is to, as with previous academic calendar holidays, I am absolutely not compelling anybody to attend a Thursday class. I mean, it's Thanksgiving and you should give thanks or do whatever you want to do. I, for one, am not traveling anywhere this year. I mean, travel has been pretty much curtailed for the most part. So I am going to record a lecture on Thursday at our usual time. You're not at all compelled to attend, and I'm not going to, you know, no one will be punished in the least if they don't, because it's a, you know, technically a holiday. But the fact of the matter is that to cover the prisoner's dilemma in any kind of fullness, I'm not sure that I can do it in just Monday's lecture without rushing. And I don't want to rush because we're going to look at the deep structure of the model and then its applications. So I'll go as far as I can on Monday in the allotted time without being rushed or hasty. I want to make sure, as usual, that people are following me step by step as we go through the material. Okay? And I'll record that lecture as usual too, so that if you miss Monday, you know, you can still tune in. So I know some of you are doing. But it is my intention, and so read my lips, it's my full intention to give a lecture next Thursday at 11, Thanksgiving or not. I'm happy to do it. I consider it part of my duty in these extraordinary circumstances, because it's going to be unfair to some of you if I don't, in the sense that, you know, the classes that meet, the breakout groups that meet on Wednesday are going to meet. You know, the breakout groups that meet on Tuesday are going to meet. And so they'll be getting their instructor's version of the second lecture on Prisoner's Dilemma, whereas those that meet Thursdays and Fridays won't meet. And so in a certain sense, you'll be deprived of the second lecture, even though it's a holiday and you're entitled to it. But if I record it, then, of course, you can simply watch it at your convenience. And since there's at least one essay topic for your third essay on the prisoner's dilemma, if any of you are interested in writing on that, on some aspect of it, then you'll certainly want to have watched both lectures, okay? So that's my justification, or rather my rationale for doing it. Yes, I'm going to do it here on Blackboard, Timothy. So Monday, it'll all be the same. Next week for me is the same deal, that we meet Monday on Zoom, as usual, at 9:30 for the plenary, and that's a very important one because that's the introduction to the prisoner's dilemma. And then on Thursday, I will be meeting here on Blackboard at our usual time of 11 o'clock, and I will be giving the second lecture or covering the remainder of the material that I may not have a chance to cover on Monday. And again, there's no obligation for you to attend. If there's nobody in the room, I'll give the lecture anyway and record it. And I'll remember to record it. That if any of you are here, if you're, you know, if you're hanging out on Thursday at 11 and you're not ready to eat turkey or do whatever you were planning on doing, then by all means join me. Okay. Either way, it's fine. Okay. Is that fair enough? Okay. So, all right. Well then, thank you for your responses. That's the plan. Just so we're clear. All right. Just so we're clear. You have the holiday Thursday, but I'll be here to do the second lecture and record it. And if you don't tune in on next Thursday at this time, then do make sure over the weekend, you know, or early in the next week, that you do watch the second lecture on the prisoner's dilemma. It will be relevant, particularly if you're planning on doing an essay on that topic, or indeed if you're interested in where that topic takes us. Okay, either way. All right. So are there any other questions about housekeeping before we proceed to today's material? All right, everyone is on the same page with the housekeeping. That's a good thing. And to get those of you who have joined late, I'm in the process of grading. No, Mame, I said this early on, that normally on campus I take attendance and grade 10% of the course on attendance. Because of the connectivity issues that some students are having on these platforms, not everyone has a good connection. And additionally, even though these platforms can, in principle, track attendance, Blackboard can, Zoom less well. Blackboard does have an attendance function. But the problem, Mame, is that if people dial in, it doesn't track their names. It just notes them as an anonymous caller. And some people with bad connectivity just resort to dialing into Blackboard with their cell phones so they can hear the lecture, but their attendance is not tracked by name if they dial in, or if you dial in. You just show up as an anonymous outside caller. So it's totally unfair, I believe, for me to be compelling attendance because I can't track everybody who's in the room. You know, it'd be unfair if you dialed in and you weren't tracked, right? And that's why I have waived attendance under these extraordinary circumstances. I'm saying that it's required, but I'm saying that I'm not counting it for or against you. Okay, is that clear? But that wasn't really your question, Mammy. Your question was on participation. Well, no, I'm not grading you officially on participation. I can't do that either, and there's no component. People who wish to speak can speak. Some of you speak more often. Some of you are very quiet by nature. Some of you may be shy, or some of you may just enjoy lurking in the background without really being here, but without participating. And I don't think it's fair to grade people on participation because some students are more outspoken than others according to their personalities. So I don't believe in grading people on their personalities. I believe in grading people on their performance. And that's why I grade you on your essays, okay? Is that better, Mame? Is that a better answer? Your question was, after all, about participation and not attendance. So, you know, participation, your way of participating is also writing your essay. You know, when you write your essay, you're showing me, in a way, how much you've been absorbing and how much you've been reflecting and how much you've been researching, which is, after all, the biggest chunk of your participation in this course, above and beyond, you know, what goes on in the chat room, right? So that's just the way it is. And all right, is everybody clear about that too? Okay, fair enough. So then let us return to the material at hand, and the mission today is to finish up Anselm by looking at historically the most salient objections that have been made to his ontological argument. And again, what's interesting is that these objections come, some of them from people who believe in God and others from people who don't, but that's not the issue. The issue is not whether we believe in God or not, right? That's a matter of faith. The issue with Anselm's argument is, philosophically, is it robust? You know, are there some flaws in the argument that we can identify as logical flaws or ontological flaws, such that his argument either persuades us or doesn't? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? So that's the spirit in which the criticism is offered. No one's challenging his faith, as indeed no one would challenge your faith or lack thereof, because that's not the business of philosophy. But the business of philosophy is to look at arguments and definitely to assess the validity or soundness of arguments on their merits. So that's the spirit in which the challenges have been offered. Okay, is that clear? It's got nothing to do with whether you're a believer or a non-believer. Good. And what's interesting, I know some of you already, I know last day, Abraham and others were already beginning to voice some criticisms, and I said, please hold off, because we're going to look at them today, and today indeed we are. All right. And if any objection that you had or had encountered is already embodied in one of these criticisms, then good for you, because you've already understood it or anticipated it. And if not, it will be giving you new food for thought, I promise. And you don't need to understand all of them. They're quite varied. I just pulled up some of the highlights, and I'm going to share a web page with you of what I think are the highlights of the most interesting objections. And we're going to go through them. We should have time today to step through them. There's only about 8 or 10 of them. We're going to look at them. And if you're baffled by some of them, then it means you need to think harder, okay, on your own time. Some of them you may get right away. Others will definitely be taking us into a little deeper philosophical water, and that's part of the learning experience. That's part of enlarging our, our canvas of ability to critique and to acquaint us more with the kinds of tools that philosophers can pick up when they want to critique an argument. Okay, so there's a specific takeaway from today, which is, what might be wrong in particular with Anselm's argument, but there are also going to be some other takeaways which will incorporate more general principles that you could utilize at a future time to critique different arguments. All right. So all I have to do now is, this is not a small thing, but before we jump to the list of historically interesting objections, I just need to make sure that you all understand Anselm to start with. I mean, if you get the argument, then you'll get the critiques, or you'll be prepared to get the critiques. If you don't get the argument yet, then the critiques may make naturally less sense to you. So I need to ask this. I mean, I'm happy to spend 2 minutes reviewing his actual argument if anyone requests that. So just let me ask the question: are you all happy with your understanding of Anselm's argument to begin with? Would anyone like to have a very brief recapitulation of it? Can you get a recap? Yes? Okay. Mimi and maybe others. I will give you a very brief recap, and I'm going to, and same, okay, well, again, there are 2 background assumptions that we need to make. I mean, Anselm needs us to make, and just so let's just check these off as we go. Firstly, that anything that exists in reality as well as the imagination is greater than the same thing that exists in the imagination alone, right? You remember that assumption? Okay, so I mean, that's okay. So that's number 1. So if something that exists both in your imagination and in reality is going to be greater than, and we give examples such as a meal that you cook, that you imagine cooking, and then the meal you actually cook and eat, or the book you imagine writing, or the essay you imagine writing, and then you actually do it, that will be greater for Anselm than just imagining it. Okay, that's one assumption. And the other assumption is and it's equally an important assumption for his argument, which is that God is a thing or a being than which no greater can be thought. In other words, God is the greatest conceivable being. I'm saying that's semantically equivalent to a more complicated way of saying that God is that thing of which no greater can be thought. In other words, God is the greatest thinkable thing. There's nothing greater than God, in other words. We can think of nothing greater than God, okay? The greatest conceivable being. And that's the other assumption. Is everybody, I mean, whether you agree with it or not, but you understand the assumption? That's my question to you. Okay, those are the 2 assumptions. All right, well, then that's fine. Then if you understand those 2 assumptions, you're well on your way to understanding the argument. So let me just pop the argument up again on the screen. I'll share that with you. And again, if you got this already, and I know some of you did, so that'll be fine. You already got it. But those of you who didn't get it, you need to follow. You just need to follow the argument. You can see this, right? I'm assuming, yeah, okay. So given we have the 2 assumptions in the background already, all right? As we've gone over. And now understand the argument. It begins with he wants to prove that God truly exists. Now, there's only 2 possibilities for Anselm. Either God exists only in the imagination, on the one hand, and God's a figment of, or God exists both in the imagination and in reality. Those are the two possibilities. And of course, taking the second one first, if God exists both in the imagination and reality, then of course, if that's the case, then God truly exists, right? So if this is true, this second disjunct is true, then God truly exists, okay? So we're done, all right? But what about this one? What about this? One of these two must be the case, right? Either or. If it's the second part, the second disjunct, then God truly exists. What about this? What if God exists in the imagination alone? So I told you that this is going to be an indirect proof. If this thing leads to a contradiction, it must be false. Remember the whole strategy of indirect proof. If any premise leads to a contradiction, we know from logic, from the laws of logic, that any assumption or any premise that leads to a contradiction must be false. So what he's able to do is to take this premise or this assumption and show that it leads swiftly to a contradiction. And the contradiction is as follows. All right, let's suppose that God exists in the imagination alone. All right. Now, we've already said that God is the greatest conceivable being, right? That's a background assumption. So if God exists in the imagination alone, then equivalently, at 3, the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, right? Because God is the greatest conceivable being, right? Are you with me so far? Step 3 clear? Yes, good. Okay, fine. Well, if that's the case, then we do have a contradiction. You see, what we can say, well, if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being at step 4, wait a second, if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, then the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. Why not? Because at step 5, if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, I can conceive of a greater being, namely that being which exists both in the imagination and reality. So to suppose that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone is actually to contradict yourself. Because if the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, the greatest conceivable being is not the greatest conceivable being. Because a greater conceivable being would be that being that exists both in the imagination and reality, and not in the imagination alone. So, do you understand the contradiction? If you assert that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination alone, you're asserting, according to Anselm, you've contradicted yourself. But wait a second, what assumption gave rise to the contradiction? This assumption at 3, that God exists in the imagination alone. That's the other disjunct. By assuming this, we have arrived at a contradiction very swiftly. But that means in the laws of logic that if this assumption gives rise to a contradiction, this assumption must be false. So if it's false that God exists in the imagination alone, what must be true? If this is false, it must be true that God exists both in the imagination and reality. Because that's obviously what the disjunct is telling us. The disjunction is telling us. So it can't be. If this thing gives rise to a contradiction, it's false. And if this one is false, then this one must be true, because it's either or. One of them must be true. So this one must be true. And that means the greatest conceivable being must exist both in the imagination and reality, the greatest conceivable being God, and therefore God truly exists. Okay? So that's the ontological argument, which purports to demonstrate logically. Yeah, did the light just come on, Mame? You got it this time? Yes, Timothy, it is. It is clever. And that's why, one reason why we're still discussing it 1,000 years later. It's not every argument that attracts people's interest over so many centuries. And you'll see in a moment how many amazing philosophers have actually thought, well, I better respond to this, whether I agree with it or not. It's important enough to attract some kind of response, because it seems to us in another way intuitively perhaps ridiculous or absurd or impossible that somebody could prove God's existence only by logic, right? It would seem that logic has nothing to do with such a huge thing as the existence of God. The logic is about, little arguments in logic, in the province of logic, and not about big statements about the universe and its potential creator. So anyway, I'm glad the light came on, and you see how clever it really truly is clever. All right, so that's good. And if that's helped, if this review now has helped that, so you at least grasp how the argument works, now we can begin to look at potential criticism. Shall we? Is everybody good now? Shall we move on? Okay. Very well. So now let's have some fun looking at the equally clever kinds of objections, because a clever argument, Timothy, you say it's clever. I agree. It is. It's really clever. It's diabolically clever in a way. And so it obviously it has challenged philosophers to be equally clever in trying to refute it, right? And trying to discover where the flaw is. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing that screen, but that's in your Google Drive folders, and you can, you can come back to that anytime you want to go over that document. It's not hidden from you. It's completely declassified. It's in your Google Drive folders. Okay. So now we're going to come to this page whose link is also in your Google Drive folders. And I found this page in my own research and, my own preparation for the course. Instead of pulling together notes from a dozen different sources, I actually stumbled across this particular page I'm about to share. And I was really glad I did, because it contains, I think, really, really good and clear summaries of some of these main arguments. So it's like one-stop shopping, okay? You can get everything right there. And let's have a look now at that screen. And again, that link is in your Google Drive folders, not the page. I didn't save the HTML, but I saved the link. So you could always presumably just paste that link into a browser, okay, and visit this page yourselves. And you can all see the page, correct? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Very well. All right, so let's look then. Let's look at it and see what some of these important philosophers have had to say. And we'll start with Gonilo, because Gonilo was a monk and a contemporary. Gonilo of Marmoutier was actually a contemporary of Anselm's. And so he debated Anselm before Anselm published his argument in Latin. I'm assuming he wrote it in Latin, as most Christian scholars did in those days. They wrote in Latin, not in English or French, but in Latin. So Gonilo made an objection, and that objection was salient enough for actually Anselm to mention in his own work on this when he first advanced the argument, and then he replied to it. So here's Gonilo's argument. Now, Gonilo makes two arguments, actually. And you may like one or both or none, you tell me, but we'll look at Gonilo. So Gonilo said, first of all, he said, look, Anselm, if your argument is actually sound, then I should be able to imagine the following thing. Let's say there's some perfect island, okay, or most excellent island, or most perfect. Imagine a tropical island, okay, which is in some way the perfect or the ideal tropical island, coconut trees and beaches and coral reefs and whatever you imagine as a perfect tropical island. So Gonilo says, according to your logic, Anselm, I'm speaking as Gonilo now, according to your logic, if I can imagine such a perfect island, then it must exist in reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the most perfect island, because according to Anselm's logic, right, the most perfect island would have to exist both in the imagination and in reality. So if the most perfect island that I imagined were only existing in my imagination, then I could think of a more perfect island, namely the one that exists both in my imagination and in reality. After all, that's the exact tactic that Anselm's using to prove God's existence. So Gonilo says, therefore, if I can imagine some excellent, most perfect, excellent tropical island, therefore I ought to set sail looking for it, shouldn't I? Just because I can imagine it. I ought to set sail, in search of it, okay? So he's not actually demonstrating a flaw in Anselm's proof. He's rather trying to extend Anselm's proof to a kind of an improbable case, yes? This is a different tactic, right? He's showing us that if Anselm's proof structurally is sound, then why wouldn't it apply to islands as well as to, God, right? You get this? You understand the objection? Okay, so what? And so isn't that a little peculiar? Because after all, what kind of sense would it make for if you could dream something up like a perfect tropical island, how could that possibly prove that it exists? You see? So he's using the structure of Anselm's proof to demonstrate something which seems to be implausible. So that's an interesting critique. He's not picking out a flaw in Anselm's argument. He's rather showing that the whole argument has something wrong with it without saying specifically what. It's the form of it which cannot be applied to anything else. So how does Anselm reply? This is really also very, very interesting reply. Anselm said to him, and you can read Anselm's own words if you want. This is just a summary. Anselm said, no. He said that's not going to work, because he said you're talking about something that has only contingent existence, not necessary existence. Do you remember early on when we talked about Descartes, we talked about truth, and we distinguished between logical truth and contingent truth? Does anybody remember back to week 1 in August? Great, I'm glad you do. Well, keep those memory cells for a little while, because if you remember that, what's logically true is necessarily true, because it cannot be otherwise, right? But what's contingently true is not necessarily true, because a contingent truth could change with circumstance. You remember that, Mami, and others? Yeah? You remember that? Good. So that's exactly what Anselm is using, that tactic to refute Gonilo. He's saying, well, wait a second. Whatever it is that makes an island the most beautiful tropical island is only contingent. Because let's say there's a hurricane, and let's say he's not saying, I'm saying, suppose a hurricane hits that island and knocks down the trees and and ruins and erodes the beach, then it's no longer the most perfect island, because contingently it could change. Yeah. So therefore, my argument, Anselm says, doesn't apply to contingent things that may be beautiful or perfect or the greatest, because they are contingent and they're not therefore permanent. But he said my argument only applies to necessary existences, and God, he says, is a necessary existence. And therefore my argument really applies only to God. Okay? So that's why if you can dream up the perfect island, it doesn't mean you should necessarily set sail looking for it, because it doesn't mean that it necessarily exists. It means it only contingently exists. Whereas God, says Anselm, necessarily exists, and therefore my argument applies to only necessary existences. Well, what's wrong with that? And one objection to that answer is, and I'll just tell you, one problem with Anselm's answer is that he's begging the question. By answering in that way, this is an expression in philosophy. I think we've encountered it. All begging the question. Begging the question means assuming the thing that you're trying to prove. When Anselm says that the perfect island is only a contingent existence, so that my argument doesn't apply to contingent existences, only to necessary existences, and God is a necessary existence, and therefore my argument, says Anselm, applies to God. He's therefore saying that God necessarily exists, which is begging the question, because isn't he trying to prove that God necessarily exists? Isn't that what he's trying to prove? Yes. So how can he then assume it in order to refute a criticism I've made against this argument? He's saying my argument is true because God necessarily exists. But wait a minute, you can't say my argument is true because it's necessarily true. You have to say my argument is true because it proves something, right? Not because it's true to begin with. The truth could only be proved, not assumed, okay? So that's how one would then object to Anselm's reply, first reply to Gonilo. Yes, circular reasoning, or begging the question, Abraham, or what we call assuming the thing you're trying to prove. Exactly. So, okay, so that's one line of reasoning. We can close that off now. We could see that maybe Gonilo's argument actually does hold weight, because the only answer Anselm could make is this circular answer. But now Gonilo made another argument as well, and that argument is actually a critique of one of Anselm's background assumptions, and that I think is a more fruitful critique. I think it's a more fruitful critique, and it gave rise to further debate, and I think some of you might really appreciate it. So let's look at it, okay? And the further criticism, you see that's still in the first paragraph. The further criticism of Anselm's argument is that the notion of God cannot be conceived. Remember, the whole thing hinges on God being the greatest conceivable being, right? The greatest thinkable thing, however you want to phrase it, or a thing of which no greater can be thought, right? Greatest conceivable being. So Gunilla says, wait a second. Why do you assume that the human mind is able to conceive of God in the first place? Right? We can't really conceive God at all. We can try to conceive of God, but if God is as great as we think, then we really cannot conceive of God because of the very nature of our imperfect existences. Human beings are frail and imperfect and mortal creatures who have only a very slender grasp of what the divine might be. If we're created by God, we do not understand our creators. We don't understand our creator, that is. Only our creator could understand God could understand God, presumably. God could conceive of God, presumably. Like you can conceive of yourself, presumably. If Descartes is right, you can, but none of us can really conceive of God. God is too great in a certain way for the human to conceive of. Do you understand that objection? Are you thinking? In other words, when we conceive of God, we don't really know what we're talking about. Well, we don't know, Mame. When we die, we don't know what happens, right? I mean, we're just talking about ourselves at this moment as living, presumably living beings, and we're trying to conceive of God. And so all I'm saying is that I'm recapitulating Gonillo's second objection to Anselm. Gonillo is saying, you, Anselm, are assuming that God is the greatest conceivable being, but Gonillo is saying, but I don't really think that we humans are capable of conceiving of God. I think God is so great that any conception we have of God, including a conception that God is the greatest conceivable being, I think that falls short because we really don't know what we're talking about when we talk about God. Is that clear at all? Okay. Well, okay, and maybe you do believe it, Mimi. I mean, that is something that one can see. I think that one can see that it's very hard for humans to intelligibly to try to describe or to categorize or to define God, right? So, I mean, I think that's fair. In which case, that would do a lot of damage to the argument because he really needs that premise, right? If you do not allow the assumption that God is the greatest conceivable being, then the whole argument falls apart. Okay, that's the real fatal criticism, more so than the one about the island. Okay, so that's Gonillo, and then of course Anselm would just say that we can, or Anselm would say that the only way we can conceive of God is only one way, and that is to conceive of God as the greatest conceivable being. And of course Anselm would want to argue that we can do that. Okay, so I mean I'll leave that debate to you. I just want you guys for now to be mindful of those two objections by Gonillo, okay? And what you make of them yourselves, of course, remains to be seen. But I want you to understand them, okay? So now we're going to look at something very different. Get ready now, all right? We're going to shift gears totally. And we're going to look at three related arguments. These are modern day arguments. Now we're going to fast forward. And these are parodies, actually, but which are in a way refutations. There are three of them. There's the devil corollary, the no devil corollary, and the extreme no devil corollary. All right, there's three different arguments, which are meant to be kind of satires or parodies or mockeries of this argument, which are intended to refute it, to show by some, satirical way that it can't possibly be a valid argument or a sound argument, rather. All right, so they're going to argue, these philosophers are going to argue, firstly, for the no devil corollary. A corollary is what? A corollary is a secondary conclusion that follows from an argument, okay? If you prove something in logic or mathematics, you may set out to prove what you initially wanted to prove, but then there may be something else along the way which actually turns out to be proved as well, okay? So it's a secondary or tertiary thing that falls out of your argument. You may actually accomplish more than you intended, And so you also have corollaries, and a corollary is something that ends up being proved along with the original proof. So in this case, the corollary, of course, will jeopardize the argument, right? And so you have the devil corollary, the no devil, and the extreme no devil. Okay, the devil corollary works as follows. Okay, we're going to take the opposite of Anselm's definition of God, and we'll define the devil as being that being of which no worse can be conceived. Right? If God is the most awesome, right? Is the most awesome being or the most terrible being? I mean, the most awesome being, then the opposite would be the devil, right? Being the most awful being. Isn't that right? Yeah. If God is the greatest being that we can conceive, then of course the devil would be the worst, right? Okay. So then his argument is going to be the same. He's going to say, well, the devil must exist because if we imagine the most terrible being that we can conceive, plug that back into Anselm's structure. So the most terrible conceivable being must exist either in the imagination alone or both in the imagination and reality, right? If the most terrible conceivable being exists both in the imagination and in reality, then the devil truly exists. But if the most terrible being exists in the imagination alone, that leads to a contradiction. Why? Because if the most terrible being exists in the imagination alone, I can think of a more terrible one, namely the one that exists in the imagination and in reality. Yeah, so that's a contradiction. So it's the same thing as Anselm, only with the devil in the place of God. So that means that the most terrible conceivable being cannot exist in the imagination alone, and therefore must exist in the imagination and in reality, and therefore the devil must exist. Okay? All right? You get it? Okay, so you use the same argument to prove the existence of the devil. And of course, the problem with that is that we all want to imagine that, that God is more powerful than the devil. But this doesn't tell us that. This just tells us that if you're going to be able to use this argument to prove God's existence, you're going to be able to use this argument to prove the devil's existence. And that will make a lot of God-fearing people unhappy, that you can prove that the devil exists. So basically, that's one kind of satire. It doesn't disprove Anselm's argument, but it just demonstrates that you could use Anselm's argument to prove the existence of the devil just as well as God. And that already casts some kind of a strange pallor on it, right? Now, there's two worse variations, okay? So fasten your seatbelts, because the devil corollary is the easiest of the three to understand. And now we'll go to the no devil. This is really clever. So just try and follow. The no devil, okay? The no devil corollary is going to take a slightly different meaning of the word terrible. When we say God is the greatest conceivable being, we also could contrast greatness and terribleness in one sense, but we could also contrast greatness, something great, with something lesser, right? The greatest and the least. Are you with me? That we talk about greatness, it has different kinds of opposites, right? So if we're talking about a great, like something like a great movie, we could also talk about a terrible movie. That would be one opposite of great, yes? But if we're talking about a great fortune, we could also talk about a least fortune, meaning nothing, basically, right? So if you had a great amount of money, the opposite of that would be having no money whatsoever, or maybe even being in debt, yeah? So that would be least, right? We talk about a very large number. The opposite of that would be a very small number. So that other sense of greatness has the opposite of lesserness. Are we clear about that? Okay, good. So so what's going to happen now is that the no devil corollary is going to be different from the devil corollary, because the no devil corollary is going to assume that the opposite of the greatest conceivable being is going to be the least conceivable being. Okay? And so here is how it works. If we take this instead and say that if the least conceivable being exists in the understanding, then it would be even so a worse being would be the one that does not exist in reality. If it's lesser, right? If the least imaginable being would be the one that exists only in the imagination and not in reality. So that means the devil exists only in the imagination and not in reality at all. You may have to think about this, okay? But if you take, yeah, wow. So this is a this is another way of attacking the argument by satirizing it, okay? So we take the term lesser to be the opposite of greater, and so the term least is the opposite of greatest. And so the least conceivable being would obviously be the one that has no real existence, but only an imaginary existence. So that's the no devil corollary, okay? And then we're going to go, wait a minute, I'm glad at least some of you are still with this. Now we're going to go one step beyond that to a worse thing, which is called the extreme no devil corollary. Okay? And the extreme no devil corollary proposes something even worse than that, which would be something that doesn't even exist in the understanding or the imagination. So the extreme no devil corollary is that the least conceivable being could not exist in the imagination either. Because something that exists in the imagination is still greater than something that doesn't exist in the imagination. So the least conceivable being actually exists neither in the imagination nor in reality. Okay? That's the extreme no devil argument. Okay? A little more silence from that. You're lost. Okay, it's okay. In a philosophy class, it's good to be lost sometimes. Okay, you got lost at the third stage? Is that the one that's losing you? It's the extreme no devil one? Okay, I'll try and say it once more. And you may need to think about this. It's quite normal. Okay, you have to think about things. It's a philosophy class after all. So don't worry. All right. So what we're taking this same meaning of the opposite of greater now is lesser. So the opposite of greatest is least. And we're going to push that even further than in the no devil corollary. So I'll ask you the question, what would be a existence or the least existence? If you could imagine something to exist, what the extreme no devil corollary is saying is that if the devil is the least imaginable existence, then basically there's something even less than that. And that is the one that can't even be imagined at all. The thing that exists in your imagination alone is still greater than the thing that doesn't exist at all in your imagination. So if the thing that exists in imagination and reality is more than the thing that exists in your imagination alone, it's still the case, this argument says, that the thing which exists in your imagination alone is also, by the same token, more than the thing which doesn't even exist in your imagination. So the least of all possible cases of existence would be the thing that exists neither in your imagination and in reality, nor in your imagination alone, the thing which has no existence whatsoever. Right, exactly, Mame. If it doesn't exist in your imagination, then it doesn't exist at all. Okay, so that's the extreme no devil argument. And this one is deemed by some philosophers to be the most powerful of these three, because this actually could, in fact, defeat the structure of Anselm's argument itself. All right? But again, these are meant to be parodies. They're not meant to be direct refutations. And you will need to think that's right, therefore the devil does not exist. Correct. But for a very strange reason, okay? Very strange reason. And it's pushing Anselm's argument in the extreme opposite direction. Okay? So you want to contemplate, those are more modern and really satirical kinds of objections. Now let's go back to more classical philosophical objections from some philosophers we've seen. Okay, I'm going to scroll down on the page a little bit. And Thomas Aquinas, we haven't seen. He's a theologian, a medieval theologian, and a very important theologian for the Roman Catholic Church. His Summa Theologica is really the backbone of Roman Catholic theology. So Aquinas is a hugely respected and important theologian, and also was a philosopher. So he's going to take up Ganilo's second objection. And Aquinas is going to say, no, we can't really know the nature of God. Humans cannot know the nature of God. It's not possible for a human to know really what God is. And so we cannot conceive of God in the way Anselm proposed. Okay? The ontological argument, Aquinas says, would be meaningful only to someone who understands the essence of God completely. Then you could claim that God is the greatest conceivable being because you could conceive God. But if we don't understand the essence of God completely, we cannot really conceive God. And therefore, we cannot say that God is the greatest conceivable being. We don't really know what we're talking about. And that objection has ultimately persuaded many Catholic theologians to reject the argument, precisely on those grounds. Okay, I think that's a lot more straightforward. Is that simpler? Am I right? Is that simpler for us to grasp? Yeah, I mean that may make sense, and that also makes sense to people who believe in God, because even if you believe in God, you may have faith in God, but having faith in God is not the same thing as claiming that you understand God's essence completely, right? I don't actually know anybody on this earth, even very religious people from any faith, who would say they understand God's essence completely. I don't know any human who makes that claim. Your faith may be incredibly strong. You may be a total believer, but you may still not be willing to assert that just because you believe means that you fully understand God's essence. So that would be a very decisive objection. Yeah, well, Elijah, these guys were all Platonists, okay? These guys were all Platonists, and so it's really germane of you to bring up Plato, because all of them, Aquinas, all these Christian philosophers were constantly affected by Plato's, which was a pagan ontology. But this notion of essence, remember, became very important with respect to the Holy Spirit and so forth. So talking about God's essence is definitely going to conjure thoughts of Plato. All right, good point. Okay, let's go on now to an atheist. This is a more complicated objection. Hume. Hume is, we've looked briefly at Hume only with his moral skepticism, which is, on the table. And remember, Kant's categorical imperative is a response, to Hume's moral skepticism. But Hume was a tremendously deep thinker, and this objection may not be easy to grasp, but it's really, I think, very decisive in its own way. So Hume says that nothing can be proven to exist using only logic. A priori reasoning means logic, okay? Basically, you can take it to mean logic, okay? Nothing can be proven to exist by logic, he says. And here's Hume's argument. It's an absurdity, he says, in pretending to demonstrate a matter of fact or prove it by any arguments a priori. Nothing is demonstrable, he says, unless the contrary implies a contradiction. Okay? And he says this does not, belief in God or claiming to prove that God exists or conceiving of God as existing does not imply a contradiction, because some people conceive of God as existing and other people conceive of God as non-existing. And so there's no contradiction there. There's a difference of opinion, but there's not a logical contradiction. And so there's no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. Consequently, there's no being whose existence is demonstrable. Only empirically, if you show me an apple, you could say this apple exists, right? But if I've never seen an apple and you say to me, I believe there's this thing called an apple, which grows on a tree but in a different climate, let's say, right? Let's say we're in Tahiti where apples don't grow. And you say, I heard a story about these fruits growing in the northern climates, on deciduous trees, and they're called apples. And I believe that apples exist because I heard someone tell me about them. And then you could say, well, yeah, maybe, but I never heard about apples. So I have no reason to believe that apples exist. So one person could conceive of apples as existing fruits. Another person could conceive of apples as non-existing fruits because they never heard of them or seen one. And there's no contradiction in that, right? There's nothing in thinking about something as existing or thinking about it as non-existing that really is a contradiction. Only in reality can we assert that things exist. So you can't prove things exist merely by logic. Is this clear? It's a more complicated argument, a deeper argument. But in other words, logic doesn't prove the existence of anything. Okay, that's the takeaway. All right, Mama, you like it? All right, or at least you get it. And you can delve more deeply into Hume. Kant made a really great argument. Kant, who chronologically follows Hume, and as you may know, a lot of Kant's philosophy, or some of Kant's philosophy, is also a response to Hume. Um, Kant is a great rationalist. And here's Kant. Kant is, I think, this argument by Kant, personally, I think it's the most decisive one, but also one that is going to lead to a lot of ontological depth. So get ready for Kant's argument, okay? And here it is. Kant proposed that existence is not a predicate. Okay, now you have to understand, in order to understand Kant's argument, it's really important for us to understand what is a predicate. So I'm going to come back to the room for a moment, okay? I'm coming back to the room, and I'm going to type into the chat room, what is a predicate, okay? We talk about in grammar, okay, we have subjects and predicates. We also have verbs, but we're talking here about a relation between a subject, we have subjects, and predicates. Okay, so a predicate is something that describes the subject of a sentence. Okay, a predicate has the job of describing a subject. Okay, I've typed that in the, everybody see that? We have subjects and predicates. So let's say I say to you, the apple is red. Okay, so the apple is red. What's the subject of that sentence? Anybody? Apple, right, exactly. Okay, and what's the predicate? Red, exactly. Okay, so you get this. And it'd be the same thing if I said, let's say the sky is cloudy, all right? Let's say I say the sky is cloudy. Okay, once again, the sky is the subject, and cloudy is the predicate. It's somehow describing the subject, right? But it's not part of the subject. You notice something important about the relationship, or I could say, I'll give you one more example. The road is muddy, okay? So the road is muddy. The subject is the road, and muddy is the predicate, and the predicate does the job of describing some feature or property of the subject. Correct? So you get this, yes? Or we say the man is angry, right? Okay, so the man would be the subject, and angry would be a predicate, which is describing something about the subject. Okay, now notice something really important. And Kant makes the following distinction. Before I explain Kant's argument to you, we have a distinction between analytic, I'm going to try and spell this, analytic statements, okay, that's one kind of statement, and synthetic, this is Kant's very important description, and synthetic statements, and I'll explain the difference to you as follows. I'll give you an example of each one, okay. An analytic statement is one in which the predicate is actually contained in the subject. Okay? If a statement is analytic, the predicate is contained in the subject. I'll type that into, okay, if analytic, and you can look this up, the predicate is actually contained. Predicate is contained already. So it's not a property. In an analytic statement, the predicate is not a property of the subject. The predicate is contained in the subject. And I'll give you a classic example. If it's analytic, it has this particular feature that the predicate is, e.g., let's say we say the following. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Okay, I'm typing this in. Bachelor is an unmarried man. True? It's true, right? And notice something, that the predicate is an unmarried man, right? That's the predicate, but that's already contained by bachelor. If you say someone is a bachelor, you've already said they're an unmarried man, correct? So that's analytic. Because, in fact, the predicate is telling us nothing new, right? The predicate is already, you don't have to say Jones is a bachelor and an unmarried man. You could just say Jones is a bachelor. That already tells us because the concept or the predicate of an unmarried man is already contained in the subject, so you don't have to repeat it. So this is not telling us anything new. It's not a new property, okay? So that's called analytic, all right? Whereas if synthetic, this is a totally different ballgame. If synthetic property, or rather the predicate, is not, as you can understand, that's the distinction. A synthetic statement is one in which a predicate is not contained in the subject. And in fact, all those previous examples are examples of synthetic statements. Why? Because to say that the apple is red is to describe a particular apple, but it's not the case that every apple is red, correct? Yeah, and very important. So if I said to you, this thing is an apple, that's definitive in terms of saying what kind of a fruit it is, but it tells you nothing about whether that apple is red or green or gold or speckled or, you know, all the different colors an apple could be. Yeah, just saying that this is an apple is not telling you anything about the apple unless I happen to say this apple is red or this apple is green or this apple is yellow. But in that case, it's a synthetic statement because the predicate is not necessarily contained in the subject at all. Okay? Is that clear? Excellent. So sometimes it's the same thing if I say the road is muddy or the sky is cloudy. Yeah, sometimes the road is muddy, but the road is not necessarily something that's always muddy. And the sky is not necessarily something that's always cloudy. So those are all synthetic statements. They're statements about the world. You could think of them as contingent, all right? Because they depend on circumstances, okay? But analytic never changes. Analytic cannot be untrue. But it's possible for the statement an apple is red to be untrue, just in case that apple is green, okay? So synthetic statements are about the world. Analytic statements are actually logical truths or semantic truths. Okay? Now, bearing that in mind, here's what Kant says. And this is Kant's objection to Anselm, coming back to where we started off. Kant says, look, existence cannot be a predicate. The notion that something exists, Kant says, could never be a predicate. Okay? He says that the concept of a necessary being is impossible. And he considers the following. Here's an example of why. If you talk about necessary propositions, let's say a triangle has 3 angles. All right? Now, a triangle has 3 angles. That's what, an analytic statement, isn't it? Isn't it analytic to say that a triangle has 3? Yes. Why? Because that's what a triangle is. It defines, a triangle is defined by a 3-sided figure, right? That must necessarily enclose 3 angles. So to say that a triangle has 3 angles, yeah, the screen is black. That's right. The predicate here is black, and at the moment I happen to agree with you, Mame, and for some reason it came up that way. But I'll stop sharing and I'll resume sharing in a moment. It's because I'm flipping back and forth and Blackboard freaks out, okay? So let's just be clear, okay? If I say a triangle, and this is Kant's point, triangle has 3 angles. That's absolutely true that a triangle has 3 angles, but it's also analytic because by definition, the word triangle also is telling us that it has 3 angles, correct? Okay, so it's an analytic statement. But here's Kant's point. To assert that triangle, that's exactly right. Yeah, but that's what it means, 3 angles, right? That's literally what it derives from. Good job. Okay, but here's the point. Here's Kant's point. We can assert that a triangle has 3 angles, for sure. Does that prove that triangles exist? Does the assertion that a triangle has 3 angles actually also at the same time constitute a proof that triangles exist? That's a deeper question. No, it doesn't. You're exactly right. This does not in the least prove that triangles exist. It only proves, and so you guys are doing great. You're following Kant's reasoning. So Kant is saying, look, to say that a triangle has 3 angles is analytic, but it doesn't prove anything about the existence of triangles. The only thing we could say is that if a triangle exists, then necessarily it has 3 angles. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a triangle, right? Sure. But that doesn't prove that triangles exist. It only proves that if triangles exist, they necessarily have three angles. Okay? Are you with me so far? I mean, you're with Kant? Yes, good. And I mean, I think Kant is totally right on this point. It's hard to disagree. But now here's where he does the same thing with Anselm. He says, okay, so God is the greatest conceivable being, Kant says. But that doesn't prove God's existence either. In fact, the idea of a greatest conceivable being is actually analytic. I mean, God has to be the greatest conceivable being. Otherwise, he wouldn't be God. Any more than a triangle without three angles wouldn't be a triangle. So if we just define God as the greatest conceivable being, that's another analytic statement. But it doesn't prove the necessity of God's existence, says Kant. It only demonstrates that if God existed, of course God would be the greatest conceivable being. The same way that if a triangle existed, it would have to have three sides or three angles. But just to assert that God is the greatest conceivable being does not prove the existence of God, because existence is never a predicate. Cannot be a predicate. All right. Now, wow. Mame says, so it means you get Kant. Well, there you go. Kant is not usually easy to understand. But and I agree, and Abraham agrees, and I think, and by the way, Kant is a believer. Kant believes in God, but again, one's faith has nothing to do with the logic of Anselm's argument. Okay, I reinforce that. Very important to reiterate. So Kant claims that a tautology, meaning a self-evident truth, cannot say anything about reality. It doesn't say anything about reality. Okay. If the statement is analytic, it doesn't show that God exists. And if it's synthetic, it also doesn't work, because the existence of God is not contained within God as the greatest conceivable being. All that Anselm is saying, all that Anselm is proving, is that if God did exist, then God would certainly be the greatest conceivable being. There would be nothing greater than God. But that in itself doesn't prove that God exists. Okay, so that is, and I think that is really coming from Kant, a very devastating rational argument, employing this distinction between analytic and synthetic. So whether you deem the statement that God is the greatest conceivable being to be analytic, if that's what it is, such that the greatest conceivable being is already contained in the definition of God, it doesn't prove God's existence. And if you then said, but God is the greatest conceivable being is synthetic, but existence is not a predicate of anything, so how could you have observed that in the world? You couldn't have. You could only have conceived it. So either way, says Kant, that all-important assumption that Anselm needs, that God is the greatest conceivable being, is nowhere containing, there's nowhere that existence becomes a predicate. And so it's neither analytically necessarily true nor synthetically necessarily true. We can't demonstrate it, in other words. So again, Kant goes on to write, and I'll share that screen with you again, just to take us to the, to Kant's conclusion. Where is it? Seems to have vanished. Okay, Blackboard is not forgiving me yet. So Blackboard is really, really being unforgiving this morning. It hasn't forgiven me for jumping back and forth. Let's see. It came back. It forgave me. Okay. So Kant goes on to write that being or existing is not a real predicate of anything. Cannot be part of the concept of something. Existence is not a predicate. Okay? Existence does not add to the essence of a being, but merely indicates its occurrence in reality. So you can read Kant's reasoning if you like, but I think you get the main point. And so we can't experience God through God. We can't experience God through experience. Kant argues it is impossible to know how we would verify God's existence. Okay, so that's Kant's argument, and you can go over it in more depth. And there are also footnotes here, which will take you, or links rather, that'll take you to these readings. I just want to conclude, and these are the main, historically the main, I think, most decisive objections. There are other objections, and I want to conclude this reading with pointing out something that Bertrand Russell said. And you may have heard the name. I hope you've heard the name Bertrand Russell. He's probably, on balance, the most famous and important philosopher of the 20th century. He was born in the late 19th, and he lived until the late 20th century. He lived almost 100 years, and wrote 71 books, published any number of papers, won a Nobel Prize for Literature, was jailed for pacifism during the First World War. He objected to the war and they threw him in jail. He was also very famously hired by City College. He was on our faculty in 1940 to teach logic and philosophy of science. He was hired by our philosophy department, but he never taught a day. His appointment was overturned by an inquisition. There was a huge hue and cry because some of his views were too radical for the time, although he was hired to teach logic, mind you. Mayor Laguardia, who was the New York mayor at the time, and the Tammany Hall politicians in the New York Times, and the Episcopalian bishops of New York, they all ganged up on him. And in this whirlwind, it went like viral before the internet, but his appointment to City College, when that was announced, it was the equivalent of viral. And all these people in New York, which you may think of as today a very progressive city, but it's not. They're still very reactionary. It's still very reactionary. It's only progressive in terms of upholding what it thinks is the latest thing that needs to be upheld. But it was way too reactionary for Bertrand Russell. And they took him to court. And they got a judge who was bought and paid for to tear up the contract. The judge declared the contract null and void, and they declared that Bertrand Russell was morally, because of his views on marriage and other things, they said he was morally unfit to teach, even though they'd hired him to teach logic, not social and political philosophy. They declared him morally unfit to teach at City College, and they overturned his appointment. Amazing story. It was like modern-day Socrates. They didn't put him to death, but they certainly put his career here to death, okay? So ironically, we had him on the faculty, but he never taught a day. Never taught a day at City College. And all of that scandal was lost. It was all caught up. Yeah, he got canceled, Timothy. That's right. He got canceled big time. And the contract was legally voided. He had signed a contract with City College, to teach in our department. He was technically a member of our department. But it would all happened over the summer before classes started. So they railroaded this thing through the courts, and the courts declared the contract null and void. He never taught a day here. And it really hurt. Hey, New York's a tough place. If you guys live in New York, New York's a tough place. You got to be tough to survive in New York. I mean, Bertrand Russell this really stung him because he was doing us a favor. He went back to Cambridge after the war. He had a great career at Cambridge, very famous, philosopher. And we had him. And we lost him. He got away. So anyway, during his earlier period of Russell's career, he was a Hegelian, and he accepted the ontological argument. And he said the ontological argument, he thought he couldn't believe it because he was also an atheist. But the ontological argument at one point actually convinced him of God's existence. Even though he was an atheist, he realized the ontological argument was so powerful that it kind of convinced him. He later criticized it. And he said, in his own words, the argument does not, to a modern mind, seem very convincing, but it is easier to feel convinced that it must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies. And I think that's a very beautiful and fitting commentary, right? Like, to a modern mind or to a postmodern mind, it doesn't seem that convincing, but it's easier, says Russell, to believe that it's somehow not convincing than to identify precisely what's wrong with it, okay? And we've just seen a number of things that might be wrong with it, but as you could see, that there isn't any real consensus among other philosophers or theologians as to precisely what's wrong with it, although we can certainly identify a number of candidates for what's wrong with it, okay? So, and with that, we will leave this 1,000-year-old problem. I'm glad to have had a chance to introduce it to you. I think you hopefully will agree that it's certainly been worth considering. The object of it is not to convince you that God exists if you disbelieve, or to reinforce your belief that God exists if you do believe, but it's to show us, I think, something about philosophy skating at the edges, right? Philosophy reaches, logically into territory that it really wasn't designed, perhaps, to reach into, namely the theological. But I hope you found it to be an interesting puzzle, at the very least. Is that fair enough? Okay. Yes. Yes. All right. I'm glad. It makes you think. Okay. That's the main object, right? To make you think. Very interesting. Okay. Great. That's great. So let me say this to you just to recapitulate, because we're basically out of time. And you can write a final essay question on this problem, definitely, if you want to. So next week, just to recapitulate, again, very briefly in 1 minute tonight, Philosophy Day, World Philosophy Day, 7 p.m., a guest lecture on Zoom. I sent you all the link by email yesterday by a very famous Western philosopher of consciousness named David Chalmers, so please tune in if you find the time and interest. Monday, very important day. It's our Monday plenary, and we're going to introduce a really interesting, to me, the most interesting puzzle of all in this section, namely the prisoner's dilemma. Some of you may have heard of it. Have any of you heard of the prisoner's dilemma before? Maybe in economics, maybe in psychology. Anyone heard of it? Yes? Okay. Very good. I'm sure some of you have. I know some of you have. And this is really interesting. And we're going to look at the deep structure on Monday. Why is it a dilemma? Why is it that we're really stuck in, with our two choices? We don't know which one to choose. It's a real great dilemma, classic, and a modern one. But also it has applications, which are astounding. And I may not have time on Monday to actually delve into the main applications and the main problems it poses, including problems about climate change, problems about environmental ethics, and all kinds of other problems. So we'll go into that. But what I propose to do, I'll just reiterate before I wish you all well for the weekend, is that I'm going to give a lecture Thursday. I know it's Thanksgiving, but I will be lecturing at 11 a.m., next Thursday. You're not obliged to attend, but I will give the lecture to those who wish to, or if no one's in the room, I'll give the lecture anyway. I'll record it because I'll need to wrap up the prisoner's dilemma next week. And some great breakout groups will be meeting on Wednesday to cover that with their instructors. But since Thursday is Thanksgiving, we have no official class. But I still want you to have access to the material at your convenience. And for that reason, I'm happy to show up Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, record the lecture here on this platform, Blackboard, and that will conclude my treatment of the prisoner's dilemma. Whether you're here or not, if you're not here, have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everybody, on Thursday. And look at that second lecture at your convenience, maybe over the weekend, okay? But in any case, I'll see you all Monday morning. That will be very important because that's the setup of the whole dilemma, okay? Is this all good? Everybody with me? An extra credit on World Full. I don't give extra credit for this, okay? The credit you're going to get is, remember what Aristotle talks about, inherent value, okay? I want you guys to, to basically take advantage. I have enough essays to grade without worrying about extra credit. If I didn't have 80 students in the class, I might be more lenient and more amenable to that. Mame, it's not an unfair question that you're asking me, but honest to God, I need to put my nose to the grindstone and really get, finish grading 80 essays by Monday. So please forgive me for not giving you, opportunities to write more. If you do, it's totally for your own benefit if you want to attend, and I certainly think that's of inherent value to you. Okay? So have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Stay safe, and you're more than welcome. And yeah, well, Thanksgiving's next week, Elijah. I'll be celebrating something. I'm not sure what, but I'm not going anywhere. But anyway, I'll see you all on Monday, right? Before Thanksgiving, we have Monday, okay? So I'll look forward to seeing you then. And have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye for now.